Okay, this video is about Edward Bellamy's book, Looking Backward. This was published in 1888 in Boston. It's set in Boston, so this is an American author. We've discussed the context that's relevant to this already, right? So there's this notion of kind of this optimism that goes along with the scientific revolution. Already in the second half of the 19th century, socialism is being entertained as a kind of principle of economic organization. And this all takes place, or this book was written during the Gilded Age, when the inequalities that resulted from the Industrial Revolution and other kind of economic factors were very apparent in the Western world. And there was a lot of hand-wringing, a lot of concern over this. A lot of attempts to, even radical attempts to overthrow that existing system and to create a greater equality. And Bellamy is, in a way, proposing his own solution to this, right? By writing a work of utopian fiction, he is being prescriptive. And it should be noted that this book sold over 1 million copies in its own day, so it was definitely a bestseller. There were over 150 societies that sprang up in the United States and in Europe, inspired by the reading of this book to try to talk about how these things that Bellamy proposes might be implemented in real society. And there were utopian experiments that took him as a kind of inspiration, right? So he did write a sequel to this book called Equality, where he takes up kind of gender equality and some other issues in greater depth than he does here. I personally have never read it. That's one of the things that I keep meaning to get to. But in any case, this is something that Bellamy spent some time on. This book remained pretty popular for about 50 years, but it's mostly disappeared, I think, from the imagination at this point. A few comments here. So, I'm not going to summarize the story for you. The main character, Julian West, is very much a kind of Gilded Age caricature, right? He says here, and it's written from a first-person perspective, living in luxury and occupied only with the pursuit of the pleasures and refinements of life, I derive the means of my support from the labor of others, rendering no sort of service in return, right? So he is one of these wealthy class people who live off of the inheritance that his ancestors gained, and his fortune keeps increasing because he owns, stock in companies, and he just keeps making money off of other people's labor. And he even gives this allegory of, this stagecoach or that has all of these people pulling it, and the ones riding on the top keep shouting encouragement to them, but they're the ones who are really benefiting from this. And anyway, you can look into that, right? The issue that kind of animates this whole, discourse in equality and inequality is what he calls the labor question. Okay, and the labor question was in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century. There were a lot of strikes. There were the laboring classes, the working classes were trying to organize. This resulted in the formation of the first unions. They were protesting against inadequate pay. They were protesting against unsafe working conditions and hours of work that went too long, and just the kind of general the general discontent over the way that workers were treated, right? In Julian West's case, this results in him not getting his house built so that he can get married to his betrothed, Edith Bartlett, right? And he's upset over this whole thing. He recognizes that laborers kind of get a raw deal in society, but this is affecting him personally, and he just wants to, he's really frustrated and wants this to be resolved, right? And that's what's on his mind when he falls asleep in the year 1887. And he does this under hypnosis, it seems. There's this professor of animal magnetism. This was something that was a kind of belief in the 19th century, that hypnosis could do these kind of miraculous things, right? And he's hypnotized, he falls asleep, and he wakes up in the year 2000. And this chamber that he's built for himself has preserved his life, because there was a fire, it seems, and nobody knows that it's there. And so he is lain in suspended animation. This is the kind of science that's not real science behind it, right? Or the science as it was understood in the 19th century. In fact, the doctor, Dr. Leet, who finds him, comments on this, and he says, "Oh, this is such a great discovery, right? That we can actually suspend the human body almost indefinitely, and it would only be that the planet climate would change, that it would lead to the ultimate decay of the human body, right?" So this is entirely plausible, it seems, to the kind of amateur scientist of the 19th century, that this could actually happen. But that's a minor point compared to what he actually finds when he wakes up, right? He thinks that he's being put on, and so he flees the house, or rather they take him outside initially. Later he gets lost in the city when he's in a moment of panic. But you have this part: "At my feet lay a great city. Miles of broad streets, shaded by trees and lined with fine buildings, for the most part not in continuous blocks, but set in larger or smaller enclosures stretched in every direction." And he talks about how beautiful it is and how clean it is and all of this. And then they have a conversation, like, "Now do you believe that you are not in the year 1887? That, and he's like, "If you had told me 1,000 years had passed, I would not think that it would be long enough to accomplish such a transformation as this." The one thing he really notices more than anything is that there's no pollution. He says the complete absence of chimneys, and they're like, "Oh, I'd forgotten that chimneys used to exist. It's been so long since we've used those things, right?" And somehow everything is now run by electricity, and it seems that they don't have to worry about where the electricity comes from somehow, right? That there would still be pollution, but I guess that wasn't necessarily known by everyone in the 19th century, right? Electricity seemed to be almost magic. So it's clean. He does say, and maybe this is just a convenience for the story, but that dress and speech haven't changed at all from the 19th century, right? He says, "The difference between the style of dress and furniture of the two epochs were not more marked than I have known fashion to make in the time of one generation." And that culture, the cultured people of the year 2000 speak exactly the same way as we did in the 19th century, right? And so we have this kind of elevated speech of the educated going on here. But then, to get into what's actually going on, right? The reason for this change is that the world has gone entirely, or the United States at least, and we find out later other Western countries, and eventually the rest of the world is headed in the same direction, has gone over entirely to socialism. And this is complete socialism. As he says, just 100 odd years before they had assumed the conduct of their own government, meaning that was in the American Revolution, organizing now for industrial purposes on precisely the same grounds that they had then organized for political purposes. That is, they took charge of all of the means of production as a collective, and the government is responsible for everything, right? This is absolute socialism. And he's like, "Well, wait a second, aren't there any problems with this? If there's no fighting over this, people's motivations must have changed a great deal." And, Dr. Leet says the conditions of human life have changed, and with them the motives of human action. No longer is it beneficial to be dishonest, to take advantage of other people, right? It's all designed so that everyone has an exactly equal chance to prosper, and an exactly equal amount that they are given by the society, right? And everybody is inspired by their commitment to this shared society, by honor, by other things. And so all of the problems that, we can now say with hindsight are there for planned communities like this, he sort of sweeps away with a wave of his hand, okay? He gets into the nuts and bolts of this a great deal, and I don't want, this video could run rather long if I was to go through every aspect of this, right? One of the things that's notable is that the working period of one's life in this fictionalized world is age 21 to 45. Labor is compulsory. Everybody has to work. But they work according to what they're best at, and they learn through the educational system what they are best at. they are put into this. So in a way, it's similar to Plato's Republic, the way that whole thing worked, and to some extent More's Utopia. But they only have to work for 24 years. And so even those who may not get their first choice of job, only have to work for this relatively brief amount of time. And then, at that point, they... sorry, I need to plug my computer in, I guess. At that point, they are able to retire and enjoy the remainder of their lives, right? This sounds like a really wonderful thing, to be honest. I'm at the age where I would already be retired. But in any case, that's neither here nor there. Okay, so age 21 to 45, they are inspired by, as he says, honor, right? He comments on, our young men are very greedy of honor and do not let slip such opportunities of, working for the common good and of excelling in the things that they do. They want to do their best to contribute to everything. And that's at the heart of all of this, right? But there are, of course, other kind of attendant circumstances on this, okay? For 3 years, they're made to labor as common laborers, doing the stuff that nobody wants to do, like taking out garbage and doing household chores and being waiters in restaurants and cleaning up the streets and these other things, right? And then they are hungry to get into their real career, and they pursue education along those lines and all of this, right? Another thing that makes this possible is that everybody, sorry, let me get to this point, okay? Everybody receives an exactly equal share. And this is the thing that just blows Julian West away in these conversations, right? What is the basis of his allotment? How does he know the amount that he's going to get? And he says, the basis of his claim is the fact that he's a man. The fact that he's a man, I repeated incredulously, do you possibly mean that all have the same share? Most assuredly, right? And then he's like, this just makes no sense until he kind of describes it. And he says, desert is a moral question. This is Leet talking again. It has nothing to do with what they contribute. It's a moral question. Everybody is a human. Everybody gets the same share. They contribute what they can. Well, then how would he put forth his best endeavors if it's not for his income? He says, well, aren't there other reasons why people do things than income? Right? Honor and the hope of men's gratitude, patriotism, inspiration of duty, these sorts of things are what lead people to do their best, and it all works. Okay, so everybody gets an exactly equal share in the form of essentially a credit card, okay? And they punch holes in this thing to indicate when they've bought stuff, right? And, of course, Dr. Leet has a daughter whose name is Edith. We learn later that this is actually the great-granddaughter of his betrothed, who thought he was dead, and he ends up in a romance with her, right? And she takes him to stores. She introduces him to the music system that they have. Everybody buys a subscription to music, and there's live music being performed all the time and piped into people's homes. He seems to be anticipating something like radio. He doesn't get quite to television. There's no visual entertainment going on, right? But music is a big part of this society, right? And the one who is at the head of all of this, I'm trying to kind of truncate some of the rest of this conversation here, is the President of the United States. He gets into the political organization, toward the end of the book. This is, let me see, it's about right here, yeah. Who's the one responsible for all of this? Well, it's the General of the Industrial Army, okay? Well, he must have power greater than the President of the United States. Well, it is the President of the United States, right? Or rather, the most important function of the presidency is the headship of the Industrial Army. And he's like, well, in my day, the government's responsibility was entirely just to keep the peace and provide for defense. He says, we don't have anything to fight over now. So they don't need to do that. What the government takes care of is that people are not in want. They're not suffering. They're not hungry. They're not sick, right? All of that maintenance is provided by the government. That is its chief goal, okay? And we learn, we get into some discussion about the educational system later in the book, and we learn that women are involved in the industrial army as well, that they work jobs, their labor is slightly different, and they're administered by a different organization. Essentially, the women supervise women and so forth and so on. So he seems to still be influenced by the stereotypes and the kind of gender relations of his day for sure. Okay, there's even a discussion about religion late in the book. They listen, for instance, to a sermon by a clergyman, and there's no discussion in that of theology. It's entirely this political philosophy where he talks about prizing equality, and kind of just goes into all of the details that govern the society, and that seems to be the theology of his day. There's nothing mystical about this anymore. There's no emphasis on kind of the theological tenets of Christianity or anything like that, right? And so this has become, it seems, this whole system of socialism has become also the religion of the society. And so hopefully that gives you a sense of what's going on here, right? This is one of the last great utopian fiction works. We don't see a lot after this because there is this turn to dystopia that seems to result from the disenchantment with the world. There are even there's a work written by the British author William Morris, for instance, that reacts against Bellamy and shows how naive this is and really takes a more dystopic turn. So there were some direct responses to this work in its own day in the 1880s, 1890s. All right, so pretty much from this point in the semester on, with one exception, I think we're going to be treating dystopia. This is an important moment in time where there is this move from kind of the optimism that accompanied the scientific revolution to a disenchantment with the prospects of humanity. That's going to lead us to dystopian literary works. Okay, good. Thank you very much.